The house sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Los Angeles, a relic of the past with its Spanish-style stucco walls and arched doorways. For years, it had been the home of Diane Delano, a character actress with a deep, distinctive voice, known for her tough, no-nonsense roles. But that voice had gone silent. Diane had passed away under circumstances that, to this day, remained somewhat murky. Some said it was natural causes. Others whispered about something stranger, something darker. After her passing, the house remained empty for years. Neighbors said they would still hear a voice at night, a voice that sounded like Diane's, murmuring, laughing, or even arguing with someone who wasn't there. Lights flickered. Shadows moved in rooms that should have been empty. A real estate agent once tried to stay overnight before listing the house, but by morning, she refused to go back inside. Then came the new owners, Mark and Lisa Caldwell, a couple from Seattle looking for a fresh start in LA. Mark was a screenwriter struggling to sell his next big project, while Lisa, a former real estate agent herself, saw potential in the old house. It was a bargain, after all, suspiciously so. From the moment they moved in, the house felt off. The air carried a strange weight, thick with the scent of something faintly floral, like an old perfume. Lisa noticed that no matter how many times she shut certain doors, she would find them open again. Mark, who often stayed up late writing, swore he heard footsteps pacing upstairs, even when Lisa was asleep beside him. Then came the voice. Late one night, Mark sat in his office, fingers hovering over his keyboard, stuck on a scene that wouldn't come together. That's when he heard it. A voice, low, husky, almost amused, muttering something behind him. "You'll never get it right," it said. Mark spun around. The room was empty, but the air was thick with the feeling of someone watching. Lisa had her own experiences. One evening, as she was unpacking boxes in the living room, the old TV in the corner suddenly flickered to life, playing a scene from one of Diane Delano's old movies. Lisa tried turning it off, but the remote wouldn't work. The screen seemed frozen on Diane's face, her piercing eyes staring out at her, lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. The couple tried to brush it off. Maybe it was just the house settling, the wiring acting up. But things escalated. One night, Lisa woke up gasping for air, convinced someone was sitting on her chest. Mark found scratches on his arms in the morning, too deep to be accidental. They called in a paranormal investigator, a man who had seen his fair share of haunted houses. He spent a night in the home, recording audio, taking electromagnetic readings. By morning, he looked pale, shaken. "There's something here," he admitted, "and she doesn't want to leave." The final straw came when Lisa found a message, scrawled into the dust on their bedroom mirror. "Get out." They didn't need to be told twice. Within weeks, the house was back on the market. It remains unsold to this day, a relic of Diane Delano's presence, her voice still lingering in the hallways, reminding anyone who dares to enter, this is still her home. The house stood in the deep hush of midnight, its white stucco walls pale beneath the cold light of the moon. The wind that rattled through the courtyard palms did not touch the house itself. Here, the air was always unnaturally still. It was as if something unseen pressed against it, sealing it off from the rest of the world, keeping everything and everyone trapped inside. Lisa had stopped sleeping through the night. When she closed her eyes, she felt the weight of unseen things pressing around her, just beyond the reach of sight. When she did drift off, it was only to wake in the dead hours with her skin clammy, her breath tight in her throat, and the terrible, unshakable certainty that she was not alone in the room. Mark had begun speaking in his sleep. It started with murmurs unintelligible at first, but then words began to take shape. Sentences, questions, answers. He would sit upright, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a voice Lisa could not hear. Sometimes he laughed softly, that small, secret kind of laughter meant only for someone else. Other times, his tone was sharp, defensive, like he was arguing. One night, Lisa stayed awake, pretending to be asleep, her body tense as a wire beneath the blankets. When Mark began to speak, she listened carefully. "No," he said suddenly, his voice hoarse, the word laced with something like fear. I don't want to. Silence. Then, so softly she barely heard it, a second voice. Low. Husky. Amused. The hair on Lisa's arms stood up, her breath catching painfully in her chest. You'll do it, the voice whispered. Mark flinched in his sleep. Lisa sat up, her heart pounding. Mark, she hissed, shaking his arm. Mark, wake up. His eyes flew open, unfocused, distant. For a moment he just stared at her. Then, in a voice that was not his own, he muttered, Why are you still here? Lisa's scream died in her throat. The words, the tone, the way they curled through the air, it was unmistakable. She had heard that voice before, on the television, in old movies, in the shadows of this house. It was her. Diane Delano was speaking through her husband. The realization struck Lisa like a physical blow, her stomach twisting with cold terror. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the headboard. As Mark's body shuddered violently, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. His hands clawed at the sheets as if he were trying to wake himself up, as if something were holding him down, keeping him prisoner in his own body. And then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Mark slumped forward, gasping for air. The room was silent again, but the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as though something unseen had just slipped away into the darkness, retreating but not gone. Never gone. Lisa reached for him, her fingers shaking. Mark, she whispered. He lifted his head slowly, his face pale, his skin damp with sweat. And when his eyes met hers, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Recognition, as if he remembered exactly who he had been speaking to. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air in the bedroom felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had drawn closer, pressing in, listening. Lisa could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic rhythm that drummed against her ribs, but Mark, he sat unervingly still. His breath came in uneven, shallow pulls, his eyes locked onto the crumpled sheets beneath his hands. The silence stretched. Lisa swallowed hard, her throat dry. Mark, she tried again, softer this time. Did you hear that? Did you hear? His head jerked up so suddenly that she flinched. His face was pale, his pupils wide. His lips slightly parted as though he had been about to speak but lost the words before they could form. Then, after a long moment, in a voice that barely sounded like his own, he said, She's still here. Lisa's skin prickled. She didn't ask who she was. She didn't need to. Mark turned to face her fully, and in the dim light of the room, she saw something she hadn't seen before, something that wasn't right. His features were his face the same, but the way he carried it, the way he sat, the way his shoulders rolled slightly forward, the way his fingers rested too still on the sheets, it was as if he were someone else, someone inside of him. Lisa's breath caught. Mark! His expression flickered. A second of hesitation. A moment of strangeness, like he wasn't sure how to answer, like he was figuring out who he was supposed to be. Then, just like that, his posture loosened, the tension in his shoulders easing. He gave a weak laugh, ran a hand through his hair. Sorry, he mumbled, voice thick with exhaustion. I had a weird dream, I think. I don't know. He rubbed at his face, shaking his head. Maybe I was sleep-talking? Lisa wanted to believe him. She really did. But deep in her gut, something coiled tight, warning her. He wasn't asleep, and he wasn't alone. The next morning, the house felt different. Or maybe it was just Lisa. She moved through the rooms with a kind of quiet wariness, her ears tuned to every creak in the floorboards, every distant hum of the old pipes. The sun poured through the windows, casting long golden beams across the tile, but it did nothing to lift the weight in the air. If anything, the daylight only made it worse because now she could see. Small things, strange things. The way the chairs at the kitchen table weren't where she had left them. The way the bathroom mirror held the faint outline of words, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the fogged-up glass and traced letters that had faded just before she entered. The way, when she walked past the old television in the living room, she caught a glimpse, just a glimpse of a shape reflected in the black screen, standing behind her. She spun around, heart hammering. Nothing. And yet, the weight of something unseen pressed against her back. A whisper of air that might have been breath if she didn't know better. The house was shifting, waking up, or worse, letting her know it had never been asleep. Mark wasn't the same. Lisa told herself it was stress, that maybe he just wasn't sleeping well, that the move had unsettled them both in ways they weren't ready to admit. But the excuses felt hollow, especially when she woke in the middle of the night and found him sitting upright in bed, his body rigid, his eyes open but wrong dark, empty, staring at the wall like he was listening to someone else. She never heard what was being said. But one night, she woke not to silence, but to laughter. Low, raspy, not his, came from the corner of the room. Lisa's blood turned to ice. Slowly, so slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. Mark was sitting up, shoulders shaking, his face barely visible in the shadows. His mouth was stretched into a wide, humorless grin. His eyes, God, his eyes, they looked too dark, too deep, as if they weren't just his anymore. Lisa's breath came in short, shallow pulls. Mark! He didn't answer right away. And when he did, his voice wasn't quite his. It was lower, rougher, something else inside of it. A ghost of someone else's tone, curling around the edges of his words. You should leave, he said, smiling in the dark. Then, softer, almost affectionate. Before she makes you stay. Lisa did not move. The air in the bedroom had thickened into something she could feel pressing against her skin, heavy and damp, clinging like an unseen hand wrapped around her throat. The sheets beneath her fingers felt too coarse, too real, grounding her in the waking nightmare that was unfolding just feet away. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his face half cast in shadow. His lips curled into that wrong kind of smile stretched too wide, as if it did not belong to him. His breath came slow and measured, his chest rising and falling with unnatural calm. He was waiting, watching. Lisa wanted to ask, who makes me stay? But she already knew the answer. Something inside Mark's expression shifted, something that wasn't his own. His mouth opened slightly, lips forming around words that never came. His head tilting in that way a person does when they're listening to something unheard. Lisa couldn't take it. She lunged for the lamp on the nightstand, knocking it over in the process, the ceramic shattering as it hit the wooden floor. The room was plunged into darkness, and in that instant, a sound, a whisper, right at her ear, soft, rough, amused. Lisa let out a strangled cry and scrambled backward, nearly falling off the bed. In the pitch black, she could still feel Mark's presence near her, except now, he was moving. A slow, careful shift of weight on the mattress, a deliberate turn of his body. And then laughter, not Mark's, hers. It came low, throaty, filled with something between amusement and warning, curling in the dark like smoke from an extinguished candle. Lisa's breath stuttered. She reached blindly for her phone, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the screen, trying desperately to turn on the flashlight. The second the light flared to life, she swung it toward Mark. He was still sitting there, but his face was wrong. His eyes, dark and distant, flicked toward her with slow, deliberate precision, as if only just now noticing her. His expression had gone slack. His smile faded, but there was something else. Something behind his gaze. A flicker of recognition. Not of her, of someone else. Lisa forced down the rising panic in her throat. Mark, she whispered, barely able to get the word out. His lips parted. He blinked, once, twice, as if waking from something deep and suffocating. Then, with a shaky breath, he whispered, I think she's inside me. Lisa had never believed in hauntings. Not really. She believed in bad feelings, in strange coincidences, in the way old places carried their histories in the bones of their foundations, but not in ghosts. Not in possession. Yet here she was. The next day, Mark acted as if nothing had happened. He laughed at breakfast, kissed her forehead, made coffee like he always did, and sat at his laptop, typing away at a screenplay he claimed was finally coming together. Lisa watched him carefully, searching for signs of something unnatural, something that proved the night before had been real. She didn't have to wait long. At exactly 3:12 p.m., Mark stopped typing. His hands hovered over the keyboard, fingers twitching slightly. His head lifted, turning toward the window, toward something outside, except Lisa knew there was nothing there. She had been sitting across the room, reading, when she saw it happen. The shift, the change, slow, methodical. Mark's expression softened. The tension in his shoulders melted away, and then the voice. Hers. Low, raspy, familiar, not a loud no. From his mouth. Lisa dropped the book from her hands. Mark turned to her then, his face eerily serene, his eyes locking onto hers as if he had been waiting for her reaction. I remember everything now, he murmured. Lisa's breath hitched. What? Mark's smile was slow, creeping, deliberate. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, fingers laced together as if settling in for a conversation he had been waiting to have for a very long time. I know why she stayed, he said, voice too steady, too knowing. Why she won't leave. Lisa's pulse thundered in her ears. Mark tilted his head. She was afraid, he whispered. Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid that, when she died, no one would remember her name, her voice, her face, that everything she built would just disappear. Lisa barely managed to find her voice. Mark, you're scaring me. He blinked as if confused by the statement. Scaring you? His lips corked up in the ghost of a smirk. I haven't even started yet. And then, ever so softly, so familiarly, he laughed. Diane Delano's laugh. Lisa couldn't move. The air in the kitchen had gone heavy again, dense with something thick and unseen, something that pressed against her skin like damp cloth. She felt her pulse hammering in her neck, her breathing too shallow, too fast. Mark, or what was inside him, was still watching her. His fingers tapped lightly against the wooden table, the sound sharp and rhythmic, as if keeping time with some unheard melody. She's been waiting, he said, his voice still soft, still wrong. For someone to listen. Lisa swallowed hard. Listen to what? Mark's smile stretched, and this time it wasn't his at all. Her story. A silence settled between them, thick and unnatural. Then, in a sudden motion, Mark's entire body tensed, his shoulders drawing tight, his fingers digging into the table. He let out a sharp, pained gasp, as though something inside him was fighting back. Lisa shot to her feet. Mark! His hands flew to his temples, his body trembling violently. His breath came in ragged, broken pieces, his chest rising and falling as if he were drowning in air. Lisa! He choked out. This time it was really him. She didn't think. She ran to him, grabbing his face between her hands. His skin was ice cold. Stay with me, she begged. Don't let her in. Mark's eyes flickered, struggling against something she couldn't see. His jaw clenched, veins tightening against his skin. He let out a raw, shuddering breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. And then a whisper, right between them. Not his, not hers, hers. You can't save him. Lisa's body locked up in sheer terror. Mark let out a strangled cry and collapsed. The moment his body hit the floor, the house changed. The walls groaned. The floor shuddered. A powerful wind, though there were no open windows, rushed through the house, slamming doors, knocking over picture frames. The chandelier above them swayed violently, casting erratic shadows across the ceiling like clawed fingers reaching downward. And then the voice. Everywhere. She's finally listening. It murmured, low and echoing, rattling through the air like a radio caught between stations. Lisa clutched Mark's unconscious body, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. What do you want? She screamed. A long pause. Then, from every corner of the house, from every wall, from the very bones of the building itself. I want to be remembered. The words crashed over her like a tidal wave, a command, a demand, a plea. And suddenly Lisa understood. Diane Delano hadn't just been haunting the house. She had been feeding off it. Off the memories, the presence, the fear. She had been making herself real again. And Mark was her way in. Lisa gritted her teeth, forcing herself to think through the terror. "I remember you," she said, her voice shaking. "I know who you are. I know your name. I know your movies." A silence. Lisa's pulse roared in her ears, but she kept going. "I know you were afraid no one would remember you," she said. "But we do. You don't have to do this." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from deep within the walls, a single brittle laugh. "You're lying." The house shook. A deafening crack split the air as a cabinet door slammed open, plates crashing onto the tile. The lights flickered wildly. Lisa held on to Mark, panic rising in her chest. "I'm not lying," she yelled. I remember you, Diane, and I swear, I'll tell your story." Everything stopped. The wind, the shaking, the flickering lights gone. And then a breath. Soft, slow, a sigh. Mark stirred beneath her, a weak groan slipping from his lips. His fingers twitched. His breath steadied. Lisa swallowed, her throat dry. She looked around, her pulse hammering. The house was silent. For the first time since they had moved in, the air felt empty, like something had finally left. They left the house a week later. Lisa never spoke about what happened, not to Mark, not to the neighbors, not to anyone who asked why they were moving out so soon after buying the place. Mark barely remembered any of it. He had flashes, fragments of conversations he swore he never had, moments of lost time that left him with an unsettling feeling of being somewhere else. But nothing concrete. Lisa never told him the full story. She didn't need to. She kept her promise. A month later, she started writing. A story about an actress with a deep, commanding voice. About a woman who had once been known, and then forgotten. A woman who had refused to be erased. She wrote Diane Delano's story. And when she finished the final words, she was never really gone. She swore she heard, just for a moment, the softest whisper of a laugh. Somewhere in the distance. Somewhere in the past. And then nothing. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.